Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the SOMM TV podcast. My name is Jason Wise. Today, Los Angeles wine. You won't believe this. At one point, LA was the epicenter of wine making in the United States. I'm not kidding. Today, I'm going to talk to Matthew Kaner, SOMM TV regular and host of the History of Wine podcast, about the history of wine in Los Angeles. And then I'm going to speak with Mark Blatty from Byron Blatty Wines about our new Behind the Glass episode that will take us through the resurgence and rebirth of a forgotten wine region in America. It's incredible stuff. Before that, I want to remind all of our listeners, our drink-along watch of A Year in Champagne with Master Sommelier Jill Zamorsky and Shakira Jones is coming up September 27th. There are 2 bottles of champagne you can order through Vivino to watch with this. You don't want to miss it. Vivino.com/SOMM TV. That's where you're going to find it. It is $100 for 2 bottles shipped in the United States. And I'm telling you right now, it is a steal. So make sure you get those before September 27th. The cutoff is coming. So go to the website, order those bottles, and join those 2 ladies for what will be, I guarantee you, a hilarious watch along of a really, really great wine film. Without further ado, SOMM TV cast member and host of the History of Wine podcast, Matt Kaner. Matt, I've missed you. It's been a while since I've seen you. Congrats on your new podcast, History of Wine. It's absolutely killing. I'm jealous.
You're jealous. Look, I have someone like yourself to try to follow up, and that's not easy. To try to jump into your shoes, into your mic. Man, thank you to all who are listening.
Yeah.
We appreciate that, and let's keep going.
Yeah, I want to say, before we get into this conversation about Los Angeles wine, which I promise you guys is more exciting than it sounds, you got to tune into Matt's podcast, History of Wine. It's excellent. I bought the whole seat for it and only needed the edge. It was great. I really do love, every episode is fantastic, and I'm honored that it's on the SOMM TV network, and I hope people are enjoying it, because I am.
Appreciate that, man. Thank you. Thank you.
Great stuff. All right, so we have this episode right now on SOMM TV. It's in our series called Behind the Glass, and Byron Blatty is the episode. If you had told me I was going to do a full deep dive on a winery that was located in Los Angeles, if you had told me that just 6 months ago, probably, maybe a year ago, I would have said, you are out of your mind. First of all, I'm not from Los Angeles. I've said this many times on the podcast. I'm a transient here like most people are. And when you come here, you just don't think of winemaking. It's just not something that is apparent. So the reason you're on the pod today is because you introduced me with Mark Blatty, who runs Byron Blatty with his wife. I have to say, it's been a revelation for me. Their wines are effing fantastic.
Hell yeah.
Really, honestly, really good stuff.
Yeah.
And they're a great personality. But I want to know, we're going to get into history of Los Angeles. How the hell did you even hear about Byron Blatty? What was your response? You've had wine bars in Los Angeles for a long time. Did you know there were a lot of wineries here in Los Angeles?
The first part of your question, how did I hear about Byron Blatty? So at the time, I was really starting to get some kind of momentum behind a restaurant I owned called Good Measure in the Atwater Village area. I got one of probably 185 emails that week of someone trying to sell me some wine. And it got my attention because it talked about being a small boutique LA winery. When you immerse yourself in a local neighborhood, in a kind of community of wine, especially in LA, you realize there's like 10 of them.
Yeah.
I mean, there's more than that, but like legit, not bullshit wines. 5 years ago, there were not a lot. I don't want to take anything away from the work people are doing anywhere in Los Angeles County, but to hear a small boutique winery in LA, it was kind of like, are you sure? So person wanted to come by and taste me on some wines. I forgot their name. I actually didn't remember what the winery was. Dude shows up in a black t-shirt, black jeans, and a Dodgers hat. And I said, fuck yeah. I don't care if the wines are good. I like the person.
It's because you're a Dodgers fan.
You know it, baby. Then the wines get open and I'm like, okay, this is where it could go south. No joke. This is not hyperbole. Of the like 3 wines that we tasted that day, maybe 4, one of them stood out as the top LA wine I'd ever had. Now, there's a little bit I need to describe about.
Yeah, because I mean, there are a lot of LA wines. I mean, this has got an asterisk there.
Yeah, there hadn't been a lot for me to try. There's Rosenthal out in Malibu, and there's the Wine Safari, and my good friends who have Angelina Wine Company had really just gotten started. There wasn't a lot to really base it on, but when all of a sudden there's like a benchmark, it changes things. It changes the way you think about it. So this wine was Byron Blatty. Mark Blatty himself in the Dodger hat, like often he dons, told me about this wine. It got my attention. I'm a Syrah guy. It was Syrah grown from the Alfonso vineyard up in like Agua Dulce area.
Yeah.
And with that, he blended some, I want to say
Grenache,
Tannat.
right?
No, Tannat.
Oh, it was a Tannat. Okay.
So at that time, when I taste this wine, I'm like, Mark, this isn't fucking LA wine. This doesn't taste like the wine that people are making in LA. The quality of what I had tasted, especially like out in the West, was not the same as this. And, you know, I started to really have to change my own idea of what we were fucking with here. There's something different here. So that was an eye-opening, mind-expanding thing for me to have happen in the LA area. And it dawned on me that maybe I needed to just try more, listen more. Shut up and listen is, it's a good thing to do. We all think we know everything, and we don't all know everything. We all don't know anything. In fact, it's better to be learning. But Mark Blatty and I started a friendship that day, and I bought that wine Agenda. I believe it was a 2016 vintage. And I had that wine on the wine list at good measure until the end of the restaurant. And it also spawned my desire to have one of his wines by the glass at both Covell and Augustine, basically until my tenure at those places ended.
Amazing. I'm going to have a conversation with Mark at the end of this, as I said, and he's going to talk about some of the more winemakery type stuff where he gets the wines. But these vineyards are essentially backyard vineyards and things spread out all over Los Angeles. They go from Beverly Hills to up near Malibu, up to, all through. And he
Antelope
Valley finds out through word of mouth that they exist. It's wild.
And I'll say, no bones about it, if someone else got their hands on the same grapes, they might not make as good a wine. They probably wouldn't.
They might not. It would suck.
This new mindset of winemaking in LA, though, especially on the east side of LA or even up into like Santa Clarita, Agua Dulce, because let's be honest, we can get into this. There's not a lot of wineries in LA. There are a lot of grapes grown in the county, but the city of LA has been quite protected as a place where you can ferment a grape into wine. And the history is mind-blowing. Got a lot to say on the topic.
Sure.
So, Mark and Jenny are pushing boundaries, as are Angelino Wine Company and Cavaletti and some other great little awesome LA kind of personalities. They're trying to move the needle and get people to think about LA as a wine community again, where the wine not only is drank here, but actually is produced here, which is cool. It's rad.
I think that part of the reason we have a buy in the glass is what we're about to talk about. The history, all of these things, but also that, when I first had their wine, I have to say I walked into it with this kind of skepticism and maybe dickishness. I don't mean to be a dick, but dickishness that I was thinking, okay, this is a novelty.
Same happened to me.
Yeah. And here is these people who are saying, I want to make wine as good as the best Napa wine, which, by the way, I think is hilarious because you hear in Napa, all they say is, I want to make a wine that's good as the best French wine. Yeah. So to have this place where I happen to live in Los Angeles, so right in my backyard, where they're like, we want to make wine that's as good as the best Napa wine. It's so funny to hear that. And so then I tasted it. I was like, wow, this is good. And then he took me down to his truck. He pulled out 6 or 7 bottles of wine. They were all blind. Yeah. And he goes, I want you to taste me these. I want you to rank them top to bottom. And I go, Mark, I never do this. Like, I'm not a wine critic. And he was like, everyone's a wine critic. I was like, all right, fine. So he said, put these in order. What do you think? And are there any that you just hate? So I tasted all these wines, and I will say they were all really good. Yeah. But one stood out, and I didn't like it. I'm not going to name which one it was, but guess what? These were all Napa wines and one of his wines. And I put his wine as the second best one. The one that I picked as the first best one was Stag's Leap's SLV, which is a very expensive bottle of wine. One of the things that I think about, though, from doing this blind tasting, why I think it's so valuable is most of the time, people who do blind tastings like this have a chip on their shoulder. They want somebody to say, look, not necessarily am I the best, but I can stand. I belong in the room. Yeah, I belong in the room. Yeah. I ended up buying some of this Byron Blatty and giving it to my father-in-law for Father's Day. This is the kind of wine he loves. And he loved it. I mean, this is the kind of wine that you don't really need the novelty. It's worth the money. I think my only argument against any wine, whether it's Malibu, any one we've mentioned or anything, is that if it's overpriced for the quality, it just is not worth it. And that is just a fact. Yeah. Again, I don't have a problem with a wine being a certain thing if it's not overpriced for what it is. That's just not okay.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I may have snuck this wine into a blind tasting sessions that we recorded just down the street from the vineyard it was grown at.
You did.
So if any of y'all are listening and love our content on SOMM TV, watch one of my blind tasting sessions with Bianca Vera, and let's see, you might score with one. Let's see.
So that was the first time I ever had Byron Blatty. And so that's our perception of this wine. And I think it goes to show something. It goes to show that there is a nature-nurture aspect with wine. And it can be argued back and forth and back and forth. And I think Mark has done something with a balance of letting the wine be from a place, but also making it what he wants it to be.
Right.
The really interesting thing, aside from the fact, okay, there's a couple here, they're making great wine. It's an unexpected region. Okay, you could find that story, fine.
And growing, which is great.
And growing. But I think what's really fascinating, what really blew my mind, is the notion that Los Angeles was probably the center of the United States wine
for a period
in the late 1800s, early 1920s.
Yeah.
Take me back to Los Angeles.
Yeah, this history began in the late 1780s. Obviously, at that time, the missions were being established starting in San Diego and moving north. And the LA area benefited from having the San Gabriel mission being kind of its anchor. It became the biggest in all of the missions wine producing. It was 170 acres of vines. The main vineyard was called Viña Madre, or like Mother Vineyard. The vineyard land was like cleared, established 1775. And then the vineyard itself was planted in 1783. I read a really interesting anecdote, unfortunately, that the first barrel of wine produced there actually fell in transit and no one got to drink it, which was a huge bummer. But, we're talking 250 years of history just outside the downtown area of LA. And then fast forward like another 40 years or so, there's really a huge influx of people coming to LA, planting grapes. 1826, a chap named Joseph Chapman. I think you're familiar with him. I think he had something to do with the Chapman University, potentially.
I graduated from there, yep. Met my wife and made all these films.
He planted 4,000 vines in LA and then got smart and moved to Santa Barbara. I'm from Santa Barbara, so, that was a really big beginning. And then in 1831, a Frenchman named Jean-Louis Vigne arrives and he planted a bunch of property. He bought 104 acres and the main vineyard was planted on what's today Union Station, where you take your train.
Oh.
So put in context, the epicenter of LA, 1831, all the way back to, the late 1780s, where the first vineyard was planted at San Gabriel Mission. Also, again, I'm going to blow your head off with this. Today, Mark Blatty and the people from Angelino Wine Company and Cavaletti Vineyards together make a wine from the San Gabriel Mission. The vine there, some people think it's 250 years old. It's unbelievable.
No big spoilers, but you'll see that vine in the next SOMM film. I will say that.
That's a special history. And I think the only older vineyard vine, however you want to measure that in your head, is at Olivera Street in downtown LA, right near Philippe's. If you ever go to get a French dip, or you go to that really overpriced Chevron gas station that's always $6 a gallon, right across the street from there, where you get maybe the best Mexican food in downtown LA, Olivera Street, is the oldest vine in all of LA. So if you go back into the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, there's this proliferation. There's 6 grape growers, 6 people who own vineyards, but there's 100,000 vines that made up about 100 acres of vineyard. And at that point, they're starting to understand there's an industry here. So Jean-Louis Vigne, the Frenchman I referenced, started shipping literally on a ship, like a sailboat, wine up the coast to Santa Barbara, to Monterey, to San Francisco area, and started to proliferate a market that would ultimately get stopped. We all know a little bit about Prohibition, whether you celebrate the repeal or whether you're a teetotaler or whatever, you probably know about Prohibition, the Volstead Act. But at that time, from 1831 until 1919, basically, there was this birth. There was a lifeblood of grape growing that ultimately got slowed down. Prohibition basically put it at a halt. But the property value, the land was so hard to keep as commercial vineyard land, or, there was a bunch of orchards with apples and oranges. They couldn't afford to leave the land as agriculture. LA was expanding too quickly. There was finally the 110 freeway built. There was a way to get around. Cars were making their way. Hollywood's developing. And what's this shit grown in the ground making wine? People are like, no, rip it out.
Yeah.
You got to plant buildings.
Yeah.
And so Prohibition and the expansion of LA and real estate prices just helped collapse an industry that truly was dormant for like almost 100 years.
It's an incredible story. And I think one that if you're into wine and you care about wine and you drink from certain places like Napa or, France or any other say an emerging region, it's really important to know where and how we got where we are. I find it to be something that is missing from a lot of wine conversations, because people will just go, something's worth a lot of money, or somebody introduced them to the wine at a steakhouse or whatever.
Totally.
I just think that without a full picture understanding, I've said this on the pod many times, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio, the Lake Erie Islands, around the time of like the War of 1812, that's where most of the wine in the country came from, because we've been under siege from the British for a very long time. And so we started planting grapes, and most of them were not even Vitis vinifera, like Catawba grapes and things like that, planting all over the Lake Erie Islands. And so it became a place where the whole entire war was fought there, and there was a reason. And when you look at Los Angeles, as the world moved west, and you have all of this wine in Los Angeles, I just think it's so important to think about, now it's come full circle, and you have people like Byron Blatty doing this wine and making it really, really, really well. It gives people a chance to look inward and say, where did our wine come from? What do we drink? Now I want to see someone do it in the Lake Erie Islands. Please, I'm begging you.
I have a couple more things to touch on really quickly.
Sure.
So obviously moving west was important. You know, the Manifest Destiny, getting a railroad ability to go west. That westward expansion on a railroad brought you to LA first. So people started there and then were able to move north from there. That gave LA clout. A lot of people saw how cool it was and never left. I understand. I moved here in 2006. I haven't left yet. So that's an important moment and thing to keep in mind is in order to get west, you ended up in LA. That's just what it was. But there's two other things to really be mindful of in this kind of, how did we get here? How did we fight through this? They're the butt of everyone's joke. When you want to celebrate, you got to have a bottle of San Antonio wineries, you know, Stella Rosa. There's like 15 different versions to go out and celebrate with. So they started in 1917 in LA, right before Prohibition. If not for being one of the most devout Catholic families in all of the world, they would have failed immediately. But the archdiocese locally allowed them to keep on and make sacramental wine. And so that gave them now 104 years of history because of their faith, right? So they continue to celebrate.
Well, they're making lots of money off of that, so good for them.
I love to drop a celebrate here and there.
Yeah.
When you drive by, you know, on the 5 freeway and see San Antonio Winery, don't just laugh. It's LA history. It's important. So they were the last bonded winery before Prohibition in LA. And it wasn't until 2005 that an additional bonded LA winery was allowed.
Wow.
And that is the Moraga Vineyard, which is a very important piece of history. This is, if you've ever driven on the 405 freeway and you weren't screaming at someone or late and, you know, freaking out on the cell phone, but you actually stopped and looked. So you've got on the west side of the 405 there, you've got what's now the Getty Center, obviously a beautiful museum. And then on the east side is Moraga. And that property there all used to be one. The same person used to own where the Getty is now. This originally was owned by Victor Fleming, the director of both Gone with the Wind and also The Wizard of Oz. It was like a horse property for him, and he'd bring all the big time actors there and whatever. But purchased in 1959 by Thomas Jones, the chief executive from Northrop Corp. So making war, making planes, why not? And this person, being very important in American landscape at that point, you know, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, was close with the proprietor of Chateau Petrus, Christian Moyu, which I'm probably not saying right. He had Christian over a few times, and Christian walks the property and says, wow, you've got limestone, you've got gravel. This reminds me of where I am in Saint-Emilion and Pomerol areas. It blew him away that it was like the right bank of Bordeaux.
It's so crazy. This is Bel Air. I mean, you know, if you've seen The Fresh Prince of Bel Air, that's where we're talking.
Yeah,
we're talking
smell you later.
Smell you later. We're talking about some of the most expensive land in the entire world.
Yeah.
In the entire world.
And so they planted Bordeaux varieties. Isn't that crazy?
I've had the wine, by the way. It's very good. I've had the wine. There's a friend of mine who actually has quite a few bottles of it. I hope to God people listening actually they don't know what the 405 freeway is because it's a nightmare parking lot all the time. I hope that this is just a far off land, Los Angeles. But to put it in context, this is not sane to plant these kind of vines here. And so,
Nope.
you know, I know that this vineyard sort of helped pull the lawnmower cord on getting things going again in Los Angeles from a winemaking standpoint.
Had to.
Yeah.
Had to.
Had a lot of money behind it that helped.
But what's so weird about it is, so they go through this huge fight and they had the money to do it in the, you know, early 2000s. They get bonded. They're allowed to make their winery. The first vintage is made there in 2005. They also realized for some reason that it was easier to send all the grapes up to Napa and make it at their Napa property. But it wasn't until more than 10 years later that LA allowed a second bonded winery to exist in downtown LA, basically like Chinatown area, which is Angelino Wine Company, which was a big deal. So if not for Moraga fighting the good fight, and P.S., they had planted vines there in 1978. So they had been there a long time before ever, I guess, entering into what a crazy fight it was to get the, you know, city of LA, the county board of supervisors to really approve this to happen. Water rights are a problem. There's fires there all the time. And it's also terraced vineyards, which they would never allow today to be planted again because of the environmental impact. The deck was stacked against any LA winery, and Moraga cracked the code. They started a precedent for people to say, I want to do this. I want to relive LA history.
It's amazing. So that, of course, leads to Mark and Jenny Blatty being able to do what they do, which leads us to this episode of Behind the Glass, which gets into a lot of the Los Angeles history. It gets into a lot of the struggles and pains, and they open up 3 bottles that I think sort of surmise their early part of their career, which is where they are right now.
Right.
Coming up next, I'm going to speak with Mark about a little bit more of the winemaking aspect and just the how the hell and why the hell do you do it of this. You know, it's such a great thing to have you on, but I really appreciate it.
Always.
You got to watch your F-bombs. My mom listens to this fucking podcast.
I love fucking LA. Sorry, Mom.
All right, buddy. We will talk very soon, and you be safe, okay?
Arrivederci.
Now I'm going to turn to somebody who actually makes wine, Mark Blatty from Byron Blatty Wines here in Los Angeles. Mr. Blatty, it's a great honor to have you on the SOMM TV podcast. How you doing?
Hey, pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Good. You're going to tell a really interesting story here. I think anybody who's listening who's been to Los Angeles knows that it is just acres and miles of vines. It is a wine region where you can find all these varietals growing. No, I'm full of shit. It's a desert here. It's full of expensive homes and the most expensive property, some of the most expensive property in the United States.
Yep.
You and your wife are winemakers here in Los Angeles. I say this facetiously. You guys make great wine. So I want to start talking about Los Angeles
Sure.
and why you would do this to yourselves. Why?
It's a good question. So I think for us, it starts with being born and raised here. LA's my hometown. Jenny's lived here for about 20 years or possibly more at this point. So I feel like one of the things when you live in LA or grow up in LA, you end up knowing all these people who are from somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
People move to LA for all kinds of different reasons. But I think when you grow up here, and my dad grew up here, and my grandfather actually moved here in the 50s, you start to have like a big affection for LA. And I think LA also gets beat on by people who don't live here, like who aren't from here quite a bit, which makes, I think, people who grew up here feel like protective of it. Maybe I'm the only one who feels that way, but that's how I feel.
I mean, you guys have won tons of NBA championships. You guys, first of all, I live in LA. Let's make that clear. And second of all, is LA really an underdog? I don't know if LeBron came here. I mean, sports people and entertainment, everybody moves out here for a reason.
I guess my point is I've got a deep affection for LA as my hometown, a lot of pride of growing up and living here, but that wasn't really the original motivating factor. When Jenny and I started to get more and more serious about wine, it actually did not occur to us, the idea of making wine in LA initially. We were starting to think about, could we start a commercial venture and maybe Napa Valley or Paso or Santa Barbara. We were convinced you had to grow wine grapes elsewhere. But it was through the learning of the history of California wine that we discovered this history that exists for Los Angeles. And once that became apparent that there was this forgotten history of Los Angeles wine, then it sort of set us, I think, on a collision course that we were going to make wine from LA, period, or we weren't going to do it at all.
So, Mark, let's talk about real estate in Los Angeles. I know that, this is not a cheap place to live.
Sure.
The housing's expensive. The land's expensive. You don't see a lot of farming here. So I think what's really important to ask you is, how the hell do you find vineyards here? Do you plant them? Do you seek them out? And how is there enough to even make any wine?
Sure. When it comes to vineyards here in LA, you've got cost of land that you said, which is obviously a big thing that's going to prevent, wide plantings of huge acres. But another major limiting factor for acreage under vines here is water. If you have a commercial vineyard, big vineyard, you need a well. Some of the vineyards actually that we work with, I think, are on city water. There's all kinds of complicating factors. So to answer your question specifically, you can't just open the yellow pages or drive down the street to the vineyard area and go talk to the local commercial wine growers. There's just not that many here, which is a big challenge for us, but also I think has helped define our wine program. And so we basically, I don't want to say cobbled together, but we cobbled together tiny amounts of fruit from various growers all over the county. So we sometimes are working with like literally backyard vineyards that might get us 1,000 pounds, 1 barrel of wine. Some larger vineyards, the biggest ones we work with are like 10 acres, and there's only a handful of those that we work with. We source fruit from there. We're basically on the hunt for any wine grapes that we can find anywhere in LA County. If the conditions are right, the varietals are right, we can find a home for it in our program.
It's a staggering thing because the behind the glass we have, it's an amazing thing to see. You're not far from Malibu and, Los Angeles County where you are pulling literal grapes out of a backyard. I think that when people think of wineries and they think of wine regions, they think of these sprawling estates and, there's this thing in your brain of going to tasting rooms. But what is so fascinating about what you are doing is you're preserving something that is incredibly historical.
That was one of the most astonishing things for us when we discovered this wine history of Los Angeles is LA is the birthplace of California wine. Winemaking in California started here. And for a period of time, if you said California wine, you meant Los Angeles wine. And I think the crazy thing is this history was basically completely wiped out. It's not celebrated. You don't read references to it. You don't see references to it around the city. There are some, but they're kind of hidden in plain sight.
It's a wild thing, living here, I look at it for better or worse. There's not a lot of water. There's a lot of contention. I mean, if you've ever seen Chinatown, the whole film is literally about LA stealing water from all the places to have orange groves and such. So when you start thinking about the grape growing thing, it just seems like what a nightmare to do it even then. And, when you have tons of land and can make mistakes and can dry farm and do all that stuff, it makes more sense. All right, let's fast forward to now. So their missions are more of a novelty now. They don't exist in any real religious capacity. Let's go to now.
Sure.
Where are these vines? Where do they exist?
So LA County is a big place. We have actually in the county, I think it's as many as 6 or 7 AVAs and a couple of sub-AVAs. So they're really spread out. Malibu Coast is obviously, well, it's not the newest. In fact, just maybe a week or two ago, Palos Verdes got official status as a new AVA. And someone asked me, oh, well, how many acres are planted in Palos Verdes? And I looked it up. 7.
7 acres.
7 acres. And it's got an official AVA. So everything in LA County is pretty micro, right? Which I think makes it pretty cool. So you have Palos Verdes. They're growing Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. You have the Malibu Coast AVA, a little further up the road. And that has some coastal sites and then some inland sites. And you have everything there from Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, Cabernet Sauvignon, Syrah, Rhone and Bordeaux varietals. And from there, you get away from the coast and then you kind of get into the high desert and sort of high elevation mountainous areas of LA County. The Sierra Pelona Valley, which is out near Vasquez Rocks off the 14 freeway. People sometimes say, oh, right, on the way to Mammoth. And then out in the Antelope Valley, the high desert, that's another AVA, sort of towards Edwards Air Force Base. That's true high desert. There's also Leona Valley, which is a little sliver of land. That's another AVA that's in between Santa Clarita and the high desert. And then there's also some vineyard sites that are not in AVAs. We get a little bit of fruit out of Bel Air, a little Sangiovese out of Bel Air. And then there's a number of small sort of private backyard projects in the Bel Air and Hollywood Hills even. And that's the thing, that actual vineyards and then the history is all kind of hidden in plain sight.
Incredible. I mean, just for people listening, I know many of you have been to LA, but, Bel Air is a place where maybe the most expensive homes in the United States exist.
Sure.
So the fact that people would plant vines, I have so many questions. Now, I have tasted your wine. I can say with strong authority, this sounds like a novelty. It's not. Honestly, the wines are excellent. But normally when you grow wine in a place where you're like, oh, we grow wine here in New Orleans, you're like, oh, really? And it's a novelty.
Right.
I hate to say this, living here, I would think that if somebody said there's wine from Bel Air. Now, I happen to know there's actually some really good wine that comes out of Bel Air. It's very expensive and very historical.
Yeah.
But aside, it sounds like a novelty. And I don't mean to say anything bad about it, but it just has that air. But, if you're sourcing grapes from a place like Bel Air, how the hell do you ever make this affordable? I mean, how do you make this wine somebody can buy?
From that perspective, someone or many people in the chain have to do it for something other than money. Right.
Okay.
The fruit that we get from Bel Air comes from a vineyard that we know actually costs them money to farm, but they do it for a labor of love and for personal reasons. They lose a little bit of money every year to maintain the vineyard. Us buying fruit and a few other wineries buying the fruit helps them offset the cost, but they're not in it for the money. And then, anyone who's planting in LA, you can't look at the planting of a vineyard as some kind of financial investment that you're going to recoup. That's a sunk cost,
This sounds like every business in LA.
Yeah, right.
It sounds also like, if you're going to plant a vineyard in Napa, you have to have the same kind of attitude, I suppose. Like, it's a long process, but you need volume. And, you can't have, like you said, I mean, if there's 7 acres in Palos Verdes, you can't even make money off that in 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
What a weird thing to be a not-for-profit type of a situation. But I think that defines it. So how is the quality? What are the grapes like coming out of here?
The quality here is just as good as anywhere in California.
That's a bold statement. As good as Napa, as good as Paso, as good as Santa Barbara, as good as...
Yeah, I mean, there are some setbacks that we can encounter from time to time. And that is when you're in this tiny little region and you don't have a lot of acreage, people tend to plant everything. So there's sometimes people, they're going to plant a vineyard and they'll plant 6 or 7 different varietals. So you might end up with a varietal or 2 that aren't quite suited, for the conditions. You also don't have a lot of historical knowledge from other wine growers to find out what does best in certain conditions or, soil types or whatever. So pretty much anyone who's doing anything down here is in some level of exploration or, kind of trailblazing in some capacity. And then the other trick is we don't have the infrastructure of there's not a whole bunch of really experienced vineyard managers and vineyard crews down here that know what to do. So finding the right people who know what they're doing can be tricky. But I'll say this then, with the caveat of making sure that the right varietal is planted in the right place and farmed by the right people. When those things happen, I think our quality can compete with anywhere in California for sure.
Yeah, I don't doubt this. What do you grow? What do you recommend?
We're a hot climate. So, not warm, hot, right? It's hot here.
Yeah.
So warmer climate grapes, there's no Riesling in LA. Let's put it that way. But even within our climate, it all depends. Rhone varietals do really well. Spanish varietals, Tempranillo does really well. Cabernet Sauvignon does well when it's planted in the right place. And then Pinot and Chardonnay out of, again, Palos Verdes, Malibu, if they're coastal sites, they're really, really nice. So I think the cool thing is, apart from, cool climate grapes, it seems like we can kind of grow anything depending on where you put it. And given LA's vast microclimates or topography, whatever, if someone's willing to do the work to plant, you can plant anything here, I think.
Yeah, especially I imagine if water doesn't become a major issue coming up here.
Yeah.
But LA's not unique. Washington struggles with water.
Mm-hmm.
Napa struggles with water.
Mm-hmm.
It's a common thing. Soil's good situation for grape growing in places where there's often not a lot of water.
Yeah.
It just is what it is.
Yeah.
Because, be fun to grow a ton of stuff in Ohio, but the problem is, it's too wet there in a lot of cases. It's just not the same.
Yep.
Let's talk about what you grow.
Sure.
What are the wines you grow? From your experience, now you guys have been doing this, a decade? Does that sound right?
Coming up on that, I think we're going into our 8th vintage this year, our 8th harvest.
It's important. A lot of people I deeply respect in the wine business. Matthew Kaner's one. They look up to you in a way that is astounding. You're a very modest guy, but people really do believe what you are doing is a revolution. And I think a lot of people too, when they think of Los Angeles, rightly so, might think maybe no wine or anything like that, but I've had your wines, and the Behind the Glass episode is not just about history, it's also about some damn good juice. It really is. You don't need the novelty of it's from LA. You don't. But I will also say, it's interesting from a sales point. So how do you sell it?
Well, good question. We're still figuring that part out. When we started, we were so enthusiastic about the notion of Los Angeles wine and had spent so much time visiting other regions, right? Where you go into, places in Santa Barbara or, the Central Coast or Napa Valley or Sonoma or wherever, and all the local restaurants are carrying all the local wines, right? If you go to Europe and you go to any part of, say, Italy, they're not carrying wine from even another part of Italy. All that you can get is the local wine. And so we thought, well, it'd be amazing. We'll just put out a really amazing, high quality wine from LA. And the fact that it's from LA, everyone's just going to jump on that. And initially, the reception was a little bit cooler than we expected. But I think that's new for any winery, no matter where they're from,
Sure.
or any wine region. And there were some people right away who I think they gave it a shot because it was hometown. I think Matt, he'll probably tell you, these guys were cool. They were Dodger fans. And, I gave him a shot because it was LA wine. But I think he had really, really low expectations. And I think that's a lot of people have. When you say, how do we sell it? We're on 2 paths. We sell a lot direct to consumer, and we sell a lot, maybe not a lot, but a fair amount through wholesale, through, wine bars and restaurants and retail shops. And ultimately, it's the same challenge, which is people are skeptical of Los Angeles wine. I think they want to like it and want to give it a chance, but it's sort of like everything in their psyche tells them that this can't be, I think that's people's instinctive reaction. I say to people all the time, our wines are from LA. And they say, right, where are they grown? And I say, they're grown in LA County. And they go, where are they from? Santa Barbara? I said, no, they're grown in LA County. And some people literally, the words out of their mouth is, you can't grow wine here. I do. Someone pointed out to me, though, I think it's because, back to what you said, you don't drive around LA and see vineyards. There's not statues in LA of, the historic winemakers of LA. People don't talk about it. And then on top of that, LA's got such a booming wine scene. We have wine here from everywhere in the world. Yeah. I think it just doesn't connect for people until they taste the wine. And that's what it's all about for us, is getting the wine into people's glasses. Because once you're in the glass, then it's a level playing field,
Makes sense. So I cut you off earlier, but what are the grapes that you prefer to work with?
We have one site in particular where we grow Cabernet Sauvignon that are a bit softer, a bit more approachable. It's probably because the heat, they don't get that structured and tannic, but a lot of that depends on how it's handled in the cellar too.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I urge everybody to go to SOMM TV and watch this Behind the Glass on you and your amazing wife. You guys, this vineyard, we were talking where we filmed, it's behind a home. Yeah. It is literally, here's a house, you could drive past it. Behind it is this vineyard that is like as steep as anything you'd find in the Mosel. Yeah. You'd fall right down the hill trying to harvest it. Yeah, I'll never forget. Yeah, I'm sure you have. I'll never forget filming there. I was like, what in the hell? Yeah. I've had your wine prior to this, so I have to, full disclosure. But then we started tasting your wine. I'm like, God, it's fucking good.
Thanks, man.
It's true. I don't mean to give you credit for something you deserve, but what I am trying to say is it goes to dispel every notion of where wine can come from, and also nature versus nurture type thing. Yeah. Because it also goes to show that if you can make great wine here, you can make great wine in Temecula, but you can also make shitty wine in Napa. For sure. Yeah. So it's a really outstanding thing when you see somebody like you with a really good paintbrush who is making wine. And I would imagine, too, the frustrating thing's got to be you don't have total control over these vineyards. Right. I mean, they're behind houses. They're in rich people's neighborhoods. It's not like you can go there at 4 a.m. and check on the shoots and do whatever when it's nice and cool. This is somebody's backyard.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have our challenges. I think at the same time, that's what makes it exciting. That's what keeps it fresh. And any winemaker or anyone who's been doing this for a while, I think, can tell you it really does take so many vintages to start to figure out. I think I've heard people say, like, you don't know what you're doing with fruit from a certain vineyard until like your 4th vintage. I think that's pretty true. You think you do. And then the next vintage, you're like, oh, wow, we learned this new thing. So some of it, I think, is just keeping at it. The longer you keep at it, you start learning these little things. And I think for us, every single year, if we can improve the quality, even just in these tiny little ways, you start to accumulate these tiny little improvements. Mm-hmm. So every year, we're just trying to like tweak it and tweak it and tweak it and tweak it. We actually just bottled just recently 450 cases spread out across 7 wines. And I was saying to the guys in the winery, this, I think, hands down, are the best wines that we've put in bottle since we started. I hope we feel like that every year.
Generally, when I think something's good, it's terrible. So I hope that you have a different... Every time I'm like, this is the best movie I've ever made. First review, it's like, well, here's a steamer. And oh, God.
Yeah, no, you get that, though. You do get that. You have certain wines where you're like, oh, this is my favorite. And then you're like, everyone else likes the other one. You're like, really? That one?
Well, and that happens in the episode. I mean, you had a vintage I won't spoil things too much, but a vintage you thought was bad. And honestly, I thought it was fucking amazing. Your wife thinks it's her favorite wine you guys have made.
It's true.
It just goes to show wine is subjective. And
wildly so.
Wildly so. And also, it's a living thing in a bottle. So it changes as it ages and the whole process and, all that stuff. I commend you for being a major part of continuing a history, not restarting it, continuing it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Where do people get your wine? People want to try this stuff.
Sure. I mean, we do and love selling direct to consumer. I mean, that's where we have our website and we love to sell to people direct and tell our stories. We ship out of state too. We're not just in California. We ship to New York, to Illinois, to Florida, a few other places. In and around LA, if you have a fine wine shop or a nice restaurant near you, the chances are our wine might be in there. We're at Wally's, we're at Providence, we're at 71 Above downtown. We're at Mission Wines in Pasadena.
Very high-end spots. It's great.
Yeah. Well, it's the places that have programs where the people really care about the wine and they're going to give each customer, one-on-one attention and hand sell and they know their inventory, places where they tell the stories of wines to their customers. Those are the types of places where we like to have our wines as well.
We have something coming on SOMM TV that you're sort of aware of, but not really, where we're going to do a bunch of blind things with Cabernet. And I'll be honest, I think people will be shocked to find your wine in this assortment. I'm curious how it's going to do, but I believe very well.
I'll be looking forward to that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. Mr. Blatty, it's an honor to have you on the SOMM TV podcast. I recommend everybody gets his wine, tries it, and gets as blown away as I was by it.
Oh, man, thanks for the kind words. Thanks for having me. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Also, keep that beard going. You look great.
Oh, thanks, man.
Thanks, everybody, for listening. Please do not forget, our drink along for a year in Champagne is September 27th. Go to vivino.com/SOMM TV. These wines are going to run out. I promise you, it is an insane deal. Go to it, get those wines. Today's podcast was produced by Nadine Netman and mixed by Alex McCourt. You guys are the best. Everybody, make sure you leave us a review. Be nice to the people you live with. Please be safe. Talk soon.